Hello again. It's the same day, the same morning, you can probably tell. Um, just for your interest, perhaps, I am sitting in my study and craft room. So this is, you can't see my study part because it's sort of right in front of me where all my books and laptop are and that kind of thing. But behind me, you can see lots of jars full of stones and tiles and that kind of thing. There's many more around the corner. And these are for mosaics. So I do a lot of mosaics in the summer mostly. And also, I'm a seamstress. So you see shelves of clothing. Just that's a little bit more about me. Today, or right now, I already talked to you today. Right now, I am going to read you Canadian Women's Movements, which was also written and recorded by Dr. Daisy Raphael. And I could have left it in Daisy's voice, but she's moved on, and so I wanted to read it to you myself. So again, this is going to be about 10 minutes long, and it's just an introduction in the big lesson on Module 2. So the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1967 and the patriation of the Constitution and introduction of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1981 are important moments in the Canadian women's movement, wherein distinct women's groups articulated unique and sometimes competing claims to rights and equality. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson established the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1967, acquiescing to the demands of women's groups to address issues such as violence against women, access to childcare, the division of labor, access to birth control and abortion, political representation, and equal pay for equal work. That was 1967. Just take a second and reflect on how far we've come on those issues. The documentary Status Quo, The Unfinished Business of Feminism, includes real footage from the Royal Commission on the Status of Women's hearings, wherein English, French, Indigenous, and racialized women testified to the particular experiences of oppression. On a symbolic level, the RCSW represented an acknowledgement that women are, in fact, a political group with claims to equality, representation, and rights. On a material level, the RCSW propelled the development and institutionalization of a more organized network of women's organizations, both within and outside of state institutions. Incidentally, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, the premier of the province, Ralph Klein, in facing some women's groups about things like shelters, for example, and again, equal pay, equal work, dismissed women by calling them a special interest group. And think about the language that was used in 1967. Women as a political group, women as a special interest group. So in one case, it was used to indicate the strength of women, and in another case, it was used to dismiss them as and equate them, I guess, to special interest groups like lobbyists for certain industries. So, just reflect for a moment on how the semantics and the discourse of these kinds of things change. Okay, so the Commission released its report in 1970, making 167 recommendations for achieving women's equality. Women's groups mobilized to pressure the federal government to enact the recommendations. Within the state, the federal government created a ministry responsible for the status of women, today called the Department for Women and Gender Wage Equality. I think it's changed again. Outside of state institutions, as a result of grassroots efforts, the women's movement established status of women committees and a national coalition, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, or NAC. In Quebec, where women were active in the Quebec sovereignty movement, women mobilized under the banner of the Fédération des Femmes du Québec. While many of the report's recommendations have been fulfilled, some, including a publicly funded national child care program, remain unfulfilled. Although there has been some movement on that in the past couple of years under the Trudeau government. The organizations and networks created as a result of the RCSW were crucial in the early 1980s, when women mobilized to ensure their rights would be protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Until 1982, the Constitution, the British North American Act of 1867, was an act of the British Parliament. It was Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau's goal to bring the Constitution home to Canada and entrench within it constitutionally guaranteed individual rights. The provincial premiers, with the exception of the premiers of Ontario and New Brunswick, were wary of Trudeau's plan to entrench individual rights. They feared this would make provinces subordinate to federal laws about rights and freedoms. Looked like we're still fighting that battle. When Prime Minister Trudeau and the 10 provincial premiers met to negotiate the new constitution, women's groups organized to ensure that 11 white men would not make decisions about the future of the country and their own rights without their input. Women wanted to ensure that the charter would apply to men and women equally, negotiating the inclusion of Section 820H, which states, "Notwithstanding anything else in this charter, the rights and freedoms in it are guaranteed equally to male and female persons." The provincial premiers also negotiated a notwithstanding clause, however. Section 33, the Charter's other notwithstanding clause, allows provincial governments to override the Charter, passing laws without regard to Sections 2 and 715 of the Charter. This was a concession made by the federal government to appease the premiers who were fearful of a concentration of power in the federal government. When the provincial premiers and the federal government reached a deal in November 1981, they neglected to consider women's rights, agreeing that Section 28, the Sexual Equality Clause, would be subject to Section 33, the Notwithstanding Clause. This meant that the provinces would be able to enact legislation notwithstanding or with disregard for sexual equality. Just consider how this is playing out currently in various provinces. Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan come immediately to mind, and is it New Brunswick, I think, as well. And how the premiers in these provinces have used so far the notwithstanding clause to attack gender rights. And in particular, the rights of transgender, transsexual, binary, LGBTQ plus. I mean, you're the roots, right? Where are we here? The former Minister of the Status of Women, Judith Arola, learned of this betrayal on a cabinet meeting, and in an act of insubordination, uncharacteristic of a cabinet minister, she told the Prime Minister that he betrayed half of the population. Not permitted to criticize her own government in public, she worked from within to reverse this decision, ensuring that no clause could override the sexual equality provision. Meanwhile, a grassroots network mobilized outside of the formal institutions of government to pressure the provincial premiers to change their minds, and women won. Once again, women demonstrated that their demands warranted political recognition. From this age, 70, I think, geez, that was only, 40 years ago? Just 40 years ago, when, a whole bunch of white guys thought it was okay to ignore sexual equality. Anyways, while white English-speaking women mobilized for sexual equality, Indigenous women were engaged in intense struggles, not only to challenge patriarchy, but to defend their inherent sovereignty as Indigenous peoples. When Trudeau sought to negotiate a new constitutional deal, he did not consult Indigenous peoples. In response, George Manuel chartered the Constitution Express, a movement of Indigenous leaders and activists which departed from the West Coast to Ottawa, then Westminster, and finally the United Nations, to demand that Canada enshrine Indigenous rights and sovereignty in the Charter. Meanwhile, the Indigenous women mounted a successful movement to reform the Indian Act, which institutionalized the patriarchal idea that a woman naturally took on the identity of her husband. Until 1985, the Indian Act specified that if a status Indian woman married a non-status man, she and her descendants would lose their status. Because of this rule, generations of Indigenous women and their children lost their connections to their communities and their land base. Sandra Lovelace Nicholas's successful legal challenge in Lovelace versus Canada resulted in Bill C-31, which removed this provision. And yet, to this day, Indigenous women and their children continue to deal with the after effects of this law. In Joyce Green's words, by defining Indian consistently with colonial patriarchal social assumptions, and then bureaucratizing and enforcing this definition, the federal government stripped generations of women of their status as Indians under the Indian Act, simultaneously depriving them of their right to live in their communities, raise their children in their cultures, and participate in the social, economic, and political life of their communities. So the cultural genocide continues at this time. Considering French, English, and Indigenous women's unique divisions within the women's movement in Canada, among French, demonstrates the intense fractures and divisions within the women's movement. In fact, perhaps we should use the plural, women's movements, instead of collapsing diverse women's movements under a single umbrella term. Women's movements are diverse, made up of distinct ideological perspectives, distinct understandings of gender, and distinct experiences with systems of oppression based on gender, race, colonialism, class, homophobia, transphobia, and disability. And there you have it. In the States, of course, at this time and even earlier, it was the Black Women's Combahee Collective, for instance, that were very prominent in talking about these issues. And the civil rights movement, of course, in the 60s really helped with, thinking about these kinds of things, which are now, of course, dismissed as identity politics, but nevertheless. So start to thinking intersectionally in this course. And this module will talk about many of these kinds of issues and also talk about sex and gender. And the challenge in Module 2 to design your own gender reveal party is asking you to think about what those parties really actually are for. What do they mean? To actually help you problematize the idea of a gender reveal party. So have a good week, folks. Remember to engage in the discussion. Continue to use the Q&A if you've got questions. Probably other people have questions too. I hope some of the navigation things have settled down. We've tried to make some improvements this week in that regard. So have a good weekend, because this is January 9th, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.